Also at 5, we're hearing from Nolan Wells, the 18-year-old who died over the weekend while on a boat trip with friends. As the mystery into his death is investigated, we're hearing from him himself.
It's really a blessing, just being here with some of my best friends, teammates, and we're all going to college together, most of us, so it's just truly a blessing to be here.
That was from February 2025, the day he signed to play football at Southwest Mississippi Community College in Pike County. He was last seen alive on July 4th on Horn Island, and his body was found 2 days later. Investigators are working to determine how he died. His friends told investigators they left the island and he stayed behind. They say he was supposed to take a different boat back to the mainland Saturday, but never did.
I would urge anyone that had information or was on the island to let us interview you and take down as much information as we can to really piece together and figure out what may have happened.
Nolan's family hired civil rights attorney Ben Crump. He says his team will conduct an independent investigation.
Nolan's family brought in civil rights attorney Ben Crump, and he made it clear that his team would pursue an independent investigation of its own. At some point that afternoon, Nolan met a 19-year-old woman named Katie McCormack on the beach. What exactly they said to each other, and what her understanding of that afternoon was, has become one of the most closely watched parts of this entire case. But before getting into her role, the timeline matters first. Around 3 in the afternoon, Nolan Xavier Wells was still alive on Horn Island, and was seen by people who knew him. That is the last confirmed sighting. Right around that same stretch of time, a separate problem was unfolding on the boat. Someone on board placed a call for towing assistance. Dispatch audio from that call was later obtained through a public records request, and what that recording establishes is not in dispute. The bilge pump, the system meant to keep water from collecting inside the hull, had failed. The boat was taking on water, and the group needed help making it back to the mainland. That recording was captured in real time, on the afternoon of July 4, 2026. Long before anyone understood that Nolan Wells would not be returning home. Because of that, it stands apart from later memory. It is not a reconstruction. It is not an after-the-fact account. It is a piece of contemporaneous evidence. Warren Hudson, one of the young men connected to that boat, later gave a public interview in which he described what he says happened next. Warren is the stepson of Jackson County Chancery Judge Ashley Cole, a detail that later became part of the wider public discussion around the case. His account was that the people on the boat were dealing with a legitimate mechanical problem and a real need to leave. He said the group did ask Nolan about coming with them, and that Nolan, according to Hudson, chose to remain on the island with the girl he had met, intending to return later on another boat. That is Warren Hudson's version of events, and it is important to treat it as exactly that, his public account, not a settled finding. GPS records later showed the boat leaving Horn Island at 4:31 in the afternoon. That timing aligned closely with the general outline Judge Ashley Cole had previously shared publicly, before those location records were made public, and before anyone could argue that her version had been shaped to match them. The vessel did not return directly and instantly to the starting point. The data showed it making its way back to the original dock by 5:44 in the afternoon, after at least part of the trip involved a reduced speed consistent with towing. After that, the same records showed movement into Fort Bayou at 5:52 in the afternoon, a return to the dock at 6:06 in the evening, and then travel to the Fort Bayou boat launch at 7:19 that night, where it was presumably removed by trailer and taken to a private residence. Nolan was not on that boat. His phone was. His keys were. He was not. By every public account available so far, no one called Christine Wells immediately when the boat first returned. There has not been public evidence that this was because anyone was consciously trying to hide what happened. The explanation offered is more ordinary, and, in its own way, more troubling. Nolan was 18. It was a holiday weekend. Time passed before the absence was treated as an emergency. That changed shortly after 11 that night, when one of Nolan's friends called Christine directly. She has said publicly that calls like that were not normal. The call itself signaled that something was wrong. Christine opened the location-sharing app on her phone and searched for her son. What appeared was not Nolan. It was the location of his phone, motionless on the mainland, inside a friend's residence. His keys were there too. Both had returned from the island. Nolan had not. Christine called the Coast Guard herself. Warren Hudson also placed a separate call around the same general period. The reported response was that, based on the way the situation was described at that time, it did not meet the threshold for immediate deployment. No boat was sent out that night. No aircraft launched. The matter was logged, but the response did not become the kind of emergency operation the family believed was needed. What followed were hours of calls, confusion, and agency overlap. Horn Island sits in the Mississippi Sound, and the question of exactly which authority had what role did not appear to resolve quickly. Eventually, the Jackson County Sheriff's Office agreed to take the formal report. Christine and Elmore drove late that night to meet a deputy in a McDonald's parking lot, and gave him everything they knew. By then, Nolan had already been missing for hours. Elmore Wansley did not wait for a fully assembled official response. Early on the morning of July 5th, while law enforcement and search resources were still being organized on shore, Nolan's father took his own boat and went out looking for his son himself. That image remains one of the starkest in the entire story. A father on open water searching before the full machinery of the official response had even finished arranging itself behind him. A command post was eventually established at the Lake Mars boat launch in Ocean Springs. The search expanded to include the Jackson County Sheriff's Department, the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, the National Park Service through Gulf Islands National Seashore, the United States Coast Guard, and the United Cajun Navy, a volunteer emergency response group experienced in water and missing person searches. Its incident commander said the organization received a direct call from Christine and moved quickly. Boats, drones, and personnel were deployed within hours. Public comments from the United Cajun Navy also highlighted the geography of the area. The current near the northwestern part of Horn Island was described as strong enough to place even a capable swimmer in danger. But one question has remained. With so many people on that beach on the afternoon of July 4th, why has no one publicly come forward to say they saw someone in visible distress in the water? On the afternoon of July 5th, the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources used drones to search the western side of the island. The heat was reportedly intense enough to cause battery swelling, which shortened the operation. Nothing was found that day. Then, early on July 6th, at approximately 8:45 in the morning, a National Park Service ranger spotted a body in the water near the northwestern shore of Horn Island. Sheriff John Ledbetter later said it matched the description circulated for Nolan Wells. The following day, July 7th, Jackson County Coroner Bruce Lind confirmed identification through dental records, and also confirmed that the swimsuit recovered on the body matched the one Nolan had been photographed wearing on the island. The search was over. The larger question was not. For weeks, one of the most important people in this case was also one of the least directly heard. Katie McCormack, 19 years old, was publicly identified as the young woman Nolan had been talking with shortly before he disappeared. By every public account, she was one of the last people outside Nolan's immediate friend group to interact with him before he was no longer seen. That made her account vital. It also made her one of the most misrepresented figures in the public conversation. At first, almost everything attributed to Katie came through someone else. A family acquaintance, social media posts, comments from relatives trying to correct rumors after those rumors had already spread widely. The problem with that kind of second-hand chain is obvious. Each version passes through another person's understanding before it reaches the public. Then Christine met with Katie face to face. According to Christine's public description of that meeting, what Katie told her directly did not line up with versions of events she had been hearing elsewhere. Christine did not publicly unpack every detail of that discrepancy, but the fact that she described the conversation that way matters. The most detailed public account tied to Katie's position came from her sister, Gracie McCormack, who spoke to the Daily Mail. According to Gracie, Katie believed Nolan was heading back toward the boat he had originally come on. She assumed, based on what passed between them, that his friends would not leave without him. Katie did not stay and watch him board. She left the island separately with her brother and his fiancée, who were part of a different group from Nolan's. Gracie also pushed back on the online version that framed Nolan as deliberately choosing to stay behind, only to keep talking with Katie. Her account pointed in a different direction. It suggested Nolan believed he was making his way back toward his own group, not making a permanent decision to remain behind while their boat pulled away. That difference is enormous. It changes the question from did Nolan want to stay, to what happened between his goodbye with Katie, and the moment the boat departed without him. Katie herself has not given a full public interview as of this recording. What exists in the public record are Gracie McCormack's account and Christine's description of their meeting. Both matter. Neither is the same thing as sworn testimony or a public law enforcement finding. But together they push attention directly back to the key gap in the case. The 90-minute window between Nolan's last confirmed sighting around 3 in the afternoon and the boat's GPS documented departure at 4:31. That is the window where this case lives. When Nolan was reported missing, his phone was already back on the mainland. Christine knew that from the location sharing search she ran on the night of July 4th. What she did not know then was what would be found on the device once it was opened. Later, when she gained access to it, both of Nolan's Snapchat accounts appeared to have been cleared. No saved videos, no saved photos. Nolan, by all accounts, was the kind of 18-year-old who documented outings like that. The expectation was that the phone would contain some kind of visual trail from a holiday gathering on the beach. Instead, material that many people assumed should have been there was missing. Some text messages also appeared to be absent. That fact alone is not proof of tampering. Phones are cleared for all kinds of reasons. Apps behave differently. Users delete material routinely. But it is a legitimate forensic question, not an internet verdict. And in modern digital forensics, deleted does not necessarily mean unrecoverable. If the right tools are used, information can often be pulled from a device long after a user believes it is gone. Sheriff Ledbetter's office said publicly that law enforcement had never had physical possession of the phone and formally requested it for examination. The family's own investigators reviewed it first. Then, after the July 15th meeting between Christine and Elmore Wansley and District Attorney Angela Myers-McElrath, both sides reached an agreement that legal commentators described as unusual. A joint, simultaneous forensic inspection, in which the family's experts and law enforcement would examine the device at the same time, so neither side could later challenge what the other found, or how the extraction was performed. That kind of arrangement does not happen in an atmosphere of easy trust. It reflected how much tension had developed, and how determined both sides were to avoid a future fight over chain of evidence and interpretation. Then there was the video. In the early phase of the case, Attorney Ben Crump referred publicly to a short clip circulating online, in which a voice seemed to be demanding a phone back. At first, his team indicated they believed the voice was Nolan's. That claim spread fast. It was quickly treated online as if it were established fact. It was not. Trayson Shepard, one of Nolan's friends, later spoke publicly, and said the voice in the video was actually his. He said it came from a separate altercation that had nothing to do with Nolan being left behind, and that Nolan was not visible in the footage. Later, when a reporter pressed Crump about the clip, his public language became much more measured. He acknowledged that the earlier claim came from a single witness, that another witness now disputed it, and that his team had audio experts reviewing the material to determine whose voice it really was. That is a public correction, and it matters. Trayson Shepard also addressed the issue of the phones. He said people in the group were leaving their phones on the boat to protect them from water, and that his own device was placed on the boat dashboard along with many others, because he was not going into the water. He also said plainly that Nolan stayed behind because he had met a girl, and planned to ride back later on a different boat. Christine and Elmore, through Ben Crump, responded without publicly attacking Shepard. Their position was that they had never personally met him, and were not in a position to dismiss what he remembered. What they wanted, they said, was every account from every person who had been there. The phone examination has not been completed as of this recording. The grand jury has not yet convened. The case has now moved into the phase where evidence stops being talked about loosely and starts being examined under documented, controlled conditions. The state of Mississippi performed its own autopsy on July 7th, one day after Nolan's body was recovered. As of this recording, those results have not been released publicly. Officials have said the report will remain sealed until a grand jury has had the opportunity to review it. There was an early public indication that no obvious evidence of drug or alcohol involvement had been found at the preliminary stage, but officials were careful to note that toxicology takes time, and that no formal cause or manner of death had been released. That silence left the family with one option if they wanted answers on their own timetable. They commissioned an independent autopsy. That examination was performed by Dr. Roger Mitchell, the president of the National Medical Association, and a former chief medical examiner for Washington, D.C., a pathologist with the credentials to handle a review of this magnitude. Colin Kaepernick helped cover the cost. The preliminary results were announced on July 22 at the 117th NAACP National Convention in Chicago, with Christine and Elmore Wansley standing beside Ben Crump. The independent finding was careful but extremely significant. Cause and manner of death, undetermined, pending further investigation. Foul play could not be ruled out. Two aspects of Dr. Mitchell's preliminary report carried special weight. First, he said that key internal neck structures, including the trachea, had not been provided to him because they had been retained by the original state pathologist. Medical experts acknowledged that retaining tissue for further study can be normal practice, especially where there may be questions involving compression or fracture. Still, it meant the independent review was working with an incomplete set of materials. Crump publicly asked the state medical examiner's office to provide its photographs and observations so the independent review could be fuller. As of this recording, that request had not been publicly confirmed as fulfilled. Second, Dr. Mitchell placed the physical findings in the context of Nolan himself. An 18-year-old collegiate athlete found in or near water presents a very specific set of questions. At the same time, local officials and volunteer responders alike emphasized that the current near the northwestern side of Horn Island is dangerous and has been tied to prior drowning events in that area. Even with that context, one question remains stubborn. If hundreds of people were around that shoreline that day, why did no one publicly report seeing Nolan in obvious distress? Two autopsy tracks, two different review processes, one still unanswered forensic question. As of now, no official cause of death has been publicly confirmed. Then came July 15th, 11 days after Nolan failed to return home. Christine and Elmore Wansley sat down with the Jackson County District Attorney for the first time since their son's body had been recovered. They arrived with Ben Crump, attorney Eric Hirsch, who has been deeply involved in the family's independent investigation, and attorney Liza Park. What came out of that meeting were two concrete commitments. First, the case would go to a grand jury once the sheriff's office finished its investigation. Second, the joint simultaneous phone examination would move forward. The grand jury announcement was immediately misunderstood by many people following the case. A grand jury referral sounds dramatic, and to some people it sounds like charges are right around the corner. It is not the same thing. In that jurisdiction, sending a non-natural or suspicious death to a grand jury is standard procedure. It does not by itself prove a crime occurred. It does not by itself mean prosecutors already believe they know what happened. It means a panel of citizens will eventually review what evidence is presented and decide whether probable cause exists for any charges to go forward. Not everyone was comforted by that process. Former Mississippi Judge Carlos Moore publicly voiced concerns about District Attorney Angela Myers McIlrath, based on an earlier case in which he believed substantial evidence existed and no indictment was returned. His argument was not that the grand jury process meant nothing, but that people should wait for results rather than treat the referral itself as meaningful progress. Attorney Tyler Bailey offered a more procedural view, saying the referral was routine, and that, even if charges were ever to emerge, they might not necessarily center on homicide. Without a confirmed cause of death, other possibilities such as obstruction or actions taken after the fact could also come into view, depending on what the evidence eventually showed. At the same press conference, Eric Hirsch made another point that captured how much public attention this case had drawn. His team, he said, was receiving between 50 and 100 calls a day from people claiming they were on Horn Island or knew someone who was. That is a huge volume of possible leads. Whether those calls produce anything useful remains to be seen. He also raised a procedural complaint. Under Mississippi law, immediate family members are ordinarily entitled to an incident report within 72 hours in a death case. That period had long passed, and the family still had not received it. Christine added that the last communication before that meeting had only occurred because she herself texted asking for an update. Afterward, the district attorney's office agreed to assign a dedicated victim advocate to the family. That may sound administrative, but it mattered, because it was an admission, even if indirect, that the communication gap had become too large to ignore. On the same day, Christine Wansley filed a petition in Jackson County Chancery Court to open Nolan's estate and serve as its administratrix. The filing described the estate's only assets as potential claims for damages arising out of the circumstances of Nolan's death. In other words, the family was preserving the right to pursue civil accountability, regardless of what the criminal process did or did not eventually produce. That was one of the most important legal steps in the whole case, and it received far less attention than it deserved. When the FBI's name entered the case publicly, speculation exploded. Some took it to mean the matter had quietly escalated into something far more serious than local authorities were saying. Others assumed the opposite, that federal involvement was more about managing attention than examining facts. The FBI's Jackson Field office eventually responded with a carefully worded public statement. It said the Bureau had been supporting the Jackson County Sheriff's Office from the beginning using federal tools and partnerships, that the Sheriff's Office remained the lead agency, and that the FBI's specific focus included interstate threats directed at people connected to the case. Sheriff Ledbetter separately confirmed that the FBI was also helping with digital evidence analysis, something he framed as unsurprising, given that Horn Island sits on federal land and the agencies already work together. That word threats pushed the case into another category entirely. While Christine and Elmore Wansley were planning the funeral of their 18-year-old son, anonymous hate mail arrived targeting their legal team. Trayson Shepard said publicly that he and others connected to the case had been receiving online threats since the story took on national visibility. Warren Hudson said the threats directed at him were severe enough that he chose not to attend Nolan's funeral. Judge Ashley Cole also said publicly that she and her family received a wave of death threats. Those threats eventually led to the first concrete arrest in the entire public arc of this case, but not over Nolan's death itself. A California man was arrested for allegedly sending death threats to Judge Ashley Cole and members of her family. The alleged messages included images of her children. Investigators traced the account through digital identifying information and took the suspect into custody. Separately, another young man, Bart Edmondson Jr., became the target of online accusations after people claimed they heard the name Bart in background audio from the towing dispatch call. His attorney publicly rejected those claims, said Edmondson had cooperated fully, and stated he had no meaningful connection to Katie McCormack before Nolan's death. A photograph misidentified online as showing Edmondson with Katie was also publicly disputed, and his attorney said a defamation case was being prepared. Mississippi Attorney General Lynn Fitch issued a public warning that threats or intimidation directed at investigators, prosecutors, or witnesses would be prosecuted. Mississippi Department of Public Safety Commissioner Sean Tyndall also said plainly that online misinformation had fueled the threat environment and that both state and federal authorities were monitoring it. AI-generated fake videos of Christine Wansley reportedly circulated online as well. Ben Crump addressed that directly and said no person involved in the search for truth should be threatened, and no one should be treated as guilty before the evidence establishes it. By then, the investigation into Nolan's death was still open, but the threat investigation surrounding the public reaction to it had already produced its first arrest. On Monday, July 20th, 2026, 16 days after Nolan disappeared, his family laid him to rest at Centerpoint Church in Ocean Springs. Visitation began at 9 in the morning and continued until 11, with the service following immediately after. Christine had said she did not want the day to become only grief. She wanted it to reflect who Nolan was, not only how he was lost. After the service, a celebration of life was held at the Jackson County Fairgrounds, open to teammates, coaches, classmates, family, media, and the wider community. Christine personally made sure players from across Nolan's football journey were included. Reverend Al Sharpton officiated at the family's request. Tyler Perry paid the funeral expenses. The service was live-streamed, a deliberate decision by Christine to let the public that had followed the case witness one of the family's most private moments. Mississippi's governor publicly blamed much of the surrounding division on the involvement of Ben Crump and Al Sharpton. That statement is part of the public record. So is what Christine did at the service. She spoke directly to Nolan's friends, the same young people whose accounts of July 4th remain central to so many unanswered questions, and she told them to take care of their mental health. In the middle of the fight for answers about her son, she made room for that. Before this closes, the record needs to be stated plainly. Confirmed. GPS data from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources documents the boat's movements on July 4th, from the 9:56 in the morning departure through the 4:31 in the afternoon exit from Horn Island, and the later return to the mainland. The bilge pump failure is supported by real-time dispatch audio recorded that same afternoon. Nolan's body was identified through dental records on July 7th. The independent autopsy by Dr. Roger Mitchell returned a preliminary finding of undetermined cause and manner of death, and did not rule out foul play. The case is expected to go before a grand jury once the sheriff's office finishes its work. The family's forensic team and law enforcement agreed to a joint phone inspection. The FBI confirmed its support role and its work on interstate threats. Katie McCormack met face-to-face with Christine Wansley. Christine filed to open Nolan's estate and preserve possible civil claims. A California man was arrested on July 30th for allegedly threatening Judge Ashley Cole, pending. The state autopsy remains sealed until after grand jury review. Final toxicology has not been released. The joint forensic review of Nolan's phone has not been completed publicly. The grand jury has not yet convened. Dr. Roger Mitchell has not publicly received Nolan's retained internal neck structures, or the state examiner's photographs and notes, all of which Ben Crump requested to complete the independent review more fully. Voyou, unresolved. Why Nolan was not on the boat when it left Horn Island at 4:31 in the afternoon. What happened in the 90-minute period between his last confirmed sighting and that departure? Whose voice is actually on the disputed video? What the completed phone forensics will reveal. Whether the state and independent autopsy findings will align or conflict. And what either outcome would mean for the direction of the case. No official cause of death has been publicly confirmed. No one has been named a suspect in Nolan Xavier Wells's death. No charges have been filed in connection with how he died. Nolan was 18 years old. He went to Horn Island over the 4th of July weekend with his friends. He had 2 days left before summer training camp. His coaches and school leaders remembered him as kind, steady, and quietly influential. His father called him a silent leader. His mother said all the best parts of her were with him. He did not come home. And the people who love him are still standing in the same emotional place they were standing that night in the McDonald's parking lot, asking what happened and waiting for an answer that still has not arrived. Unsolved files will be here when it does. The state autopsy, the phone forensics, and the grand jury process are all moving toward the next phase, and whichever one breaks first is likely to shape everything that follows. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you are not trying to catch up after the story has already moved. This is the most consequential stage the case has entered since Nolan's body was found.